Hello, everyone. This is a new episode of the Freedom of Religion or Belief podcast that we are making as part of the Talk About Law and Religion blog. I am Merilin Kiviorg, an associate professor at the University of Tartu in Estonia, and my co-host is Dmytro Vovk, a visiting associate professor at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law. Hi, Dmytro.
Hello, Merilin. Hello.
Our guest today is a prominent scholar in the field, Professor of Law Jocelyn Getgen Kestenbaum. Jocelyn is a professor of law at the Cardozo School of Law, where she also directs the Benjamin B. Ferencz Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Clinic and the Cardozo Law Institute in Holocaust and Human Rights. Her scholarship focuses on human rights, public health, and atrocity prevention, especially related to preventing and responding to sexual and gender-based crimes, slavery and the slave trade, genocide, indigenous rights, and human rights violations against other minority groups. Hello, Jocelyn. It is really great to have you here as our guest.
Hi, Merilin. Hi, Dmytro. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Today's discussion was sparked by the fact that August 2024 marked 10 years since ISIL attacked the Yazidi people. ISIL stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, also known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and Daesh. It is a terrorist entity. In the early hours of August 3rd, 2014, fighters from this terrorist group flooded out of their bases in Syria and Iraq and swept across Sinjar. The Sinjar region of northern Iraq is at its nearest point, less than 15 kilometers from the Syrian border. It is home for majority of the world's Yazidis, a distinct religious community whose beliefs and practices span thousands of years and whose adherents ISIS considers infidels. The ISIL fighters were killing, displacing, and capturing men, women, boys, and girls from the 400,000 strong community. It has been established by multiple UN reports that ISIL committed genocide as well as multiple crimes against humanity and war crimes through mass executions, forced religious conversions to Islam, enslavement, and widespread sexual violence against women and girls. Following the attack on Sinjar, ISIL forcibly transferred thousands of captured Yazidis into Syria, where girls as young as 9 were subjected to sexual slavery, and Yazidi boys as young as 7 were forcibly trained for combat roles and suicide missions. There is also another problem. After the fall of the last ISIL stronghold in Syria, thousands of men, boys, women, and girls perceived to be ISIL fighters or affiliated with ISIL were captured and transferred to detention sites in northeast Syria. These were just some statements from recent reports. As stated in the UN Syria Commission of Inquiry report, over the decade, there has been no justice and accountability for most Yazidis, and the fate of thousands of missing Yazidi people remains unknown. Jocelyn, you have been working extensively in the area. Can you tell us more about Yazidis and the context of these atrocities?
Sure. So thank you so much again, Merilin, for having me. I wanted to talk first a little bit about the Yazidi people. So the Yazidis are considered to be an ethno-religious minority group. They are considered to be indigenous to the Kurdish regions, generally of northern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And while the total population is relatively unknown, there are estimated between 200,000 and 1 million Yazidis living in that region and throughout the diaspora, especially now after the violence perpetrated by ISIS starting in 2014. Yazidism, the religious practices of the Yazidis, is thousands of years old. It's primarily considered to be an oral religion, oral traditions, and therefore there's really no central book like a Bible or something that the Yazidis use to disseminate their traditions. And for that reason, the traditions are generally passed from one generation to the next, orally, through familial ties and close community ties. And for that reason as well, because there's no central book, there are some variations in the teachings and in the practice of the Yazidis, but generally speaking, they are a monotheistic group. They believe in one God, and that one God, though, speaks through what they consider to be these divine emanations or angels, and there are 7 angels in the traditions and the teachings of Yazidis. Chief among those angels is Melik Taus, which is considered also translated as the peacock angel. It is really, when you see the symbol of Yazidis, often you see the peacock as a main symbol for the religion. And that is a representation of this chief spiritual eminent being of the divine. Some do accuse Yazidis of being devil worshippers, and that is generally because of a misunderstanding of this chief divine emanation, Melik Taus, because in the teachings and the narratives and the stories that the Yazidis tell, and Yazidis have a mix of, the Judeo-Christian teachings and things as well. So they believe they're descended from Adam and Eve, the biblical story of Adam and Eve, and that Melik Taus was the angel that leads Adam away from the Garden of Eden. But unlike the biblical story, where it was sort of a casting out of humanity from the divine sort of Garden of Eden, where everything is perfect, the Yazidis believe that this was a positive thing, and though Melik Taus does get confused often with Satan because of the Christian biblical story of Adam and Eve. And another thing about the Yazidis is they consider the Valley of Lalish to be a very sacred, holy place. It is considered to be the birthplace of Adam, and where these celestial beings that are these divine emanations of God descended to earth. And so that place for Yazidis in Sinjar is extremely holy and important in their religious practice and teachings. And there is a festival every year in October called the Feast of the Assembly. And that is generally when many Yazidis find it important to make pilgrimage to the Valley of Lalish to celebrate in community with others. It's a belief system that is very much rooted in practice, and because of these oral traditions, very much rooted in passing down from one generation to the next these particular teachings. Some of the teachings are that you are not permitted to marry outside of the religion, and that there's no conversion in Yazidi tradition. So that is important to understand why this was such a devastating attack against this particular minority religion, because if two parents are not Yazidi by birth, then the child will not be considered to be Yazidi. And because there's no conversion, that really does decimate the population and destroy the group as such very, very quickly from one generation to the next. Some of the other traditions are that there is a parading of the peacock every year as well. There is a symbol of the peacock that is used in those religious festivals, and it's also considered a very sacred time for them. Identity-wise, Yazidis are considered to be an ethnic minority as well in the region. They speak a language called Kamanji, And some Yazidis, not all, consider themselves to be the original Kurds, Kurdish people. So you could say that all Yazidis are Kurdish, not all Kurds are Yazidi. That's at least how many people consider this to be in the ethnic identity aspect of being Yazidi. And there is a caste system amongst the Yazidi identity, the sheiks, the pirs, and the murids. And the first two, the sheiks, the pirs, are considered to be religious castes. And then the murids are considered to be everyone else socially. And because marriage has to be within the religion, even further than that is that marriage is generally restricted to the caste that you belong to, while pretty much every other social function caste is mixed, but marriage is considered to be extremely important to marry within the caste in which you are born. The acts against the Yazidis by ISIS, Daesh on August 3rd, 2014, was, according to the Yazidis, the 74th genocide that has been perpetrated against them. So that signifies just really how persecuted this particular religious minority is in the region. And the terrorist organization, ISIS, the Islamic State, forced Yazidi victims to convert, right, to their fundamentalist Salafi vision of Sunni Islam. And that is another indication that ISIS really did view Yazidis as a distinct ethno-religious group for the purposes of understanding the law of genocide and its perpetration. And you described very well what happened on August 3rd. I would just say that, later these acts were characterized as genocide, as slave trade, as enslavement, sexual slavery, amongst many other crimes that were perpetrated against the Yazidi people by ISIS.
And this is not the first episode of such atrocities and violence against the Yazidi people, right?
So there is a long-standing history of persecution and violence against the Yazidi people. And like I said, this particular act by ISIS, while it was extreme and caused very serious suffering, forced displacement, a lot of violence, international crimes, including genocide against these people, it was not by any means the first time that this group has faced violence, persecution in the region because of their minority status religiously. They are often considered to be quote unquote infidels or non-believers. And so that really brings to this particular minority violence and persecution generally by many of their neighboring collectives and groups in the surrounding area.
And am I right, religion is a sort of prime cause of this violence and atrocities, or ethnicity, or mixed?
Yeah, I would say it's a mix. It's a real mix because their minority status as Kurdish in the region, where the Kurdish people generally are also recipients of huge amounts of persecution and violence based on their ethnic identity, but also because of their religious minority status, because their religion, as described, as I just laid out, is very much insular. It relies on the passing from generation to generation by birth. And intermarriage, therefore, is extremely important. And so social relations, religious teachings, everything is really community-based. And it becomes very insular so that the group can replicate itself intergenerationally. But that also leads to a lot of misunderstandings and, mischaracterizations of the religion and how the people are perceived to be, anti-monotheist or Satan, devil worshippers. Those are all myths that are carried out in the larger society against Yazidis, those belief systems, because of the way in which the religion is practiced insularly. But that, obviously that doesn't mean that that they are guilty of anything. It's really this long-standing persecutorial victimization in the region.
Jocelyn, considering that many of the reports are saying that we haven't done enough or there is not enough political will to deal with the Yazidi genocides, has the responsibility to deal with the cases, because we also we're not only talking about sort of individual responsibility of perpetrators, but also state responsibility here. We have so many multiple layers to this question. And what are the possible avenues we can take to prosecute and also find states accountable for not doing enough, perhaps for the adhering to even to the Genocide Convention, for example?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think there are many potential avenues for redress in this situation. And then there are many obstacles and challenges to that very same possibility for both in accounting from a state responsibility perspective and individual criminal accountability perspective. So first, to just say that, justice and accountability to victims that are searching for justice really should begin at the national level, at the domestic level. And so therefore, Iraq and Syria have a role to play in ensuring that Yazidis find accountability, both through criminal law, domestic criminal law, and also from a reparations standpoint. Of course, the challenges, especially in Syria, are very difficult for that to go forward. There has been efforts on the ground in Iraq for a Yazidi Survivors Act. That reparations plan was passed. It was also heavily criticized because it tied reparations to victims coming forward and filing criminal charges against their perpetrators. And so there is often stigma and shame associated with what happened to Yazidi survivors. And that is a challenge in bringing forward claims, and especially criminal cases. And then the evidence is difficult to find and gather and then have at the level needed to convict criminally individual perpetrators, especially now that UNITAD, the UN team that was tasked with gathering evidence, has now closed, unfortunately. So Iraq also has some laws, domestic laws. It can, I think there is a criminal law for rape, for slavery, but generally the international crimes that Daesh perpetrated against Yazidis at the domestic level right now cannot be brought practically in the domestic courts of Iraq. And that is a huge challenge. There is a bill ready to be passed. It just has not been passed up until this point. So that is somewhat disappointing, but this often happens when we are talking about international criminal justice and responsibility. In the sense of international courts, we have the International Criminal Court. That is really not an accessible avenue for justice for Yazidis and for the perpetrators of Daesh in this case, because both Syria and Iraq are not states parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and therefore there is no jurisdiction to bring those perpetrators to account. But we do have several avenues that have been sought, and this is also a testament to the idea really that victim survivors drive this seeking of accountability and justice, because perpetrators are being found in other jurisdictions, mainly in Europe, in Germany, in Sweden, other places, other European countries. And when the perpetrators are in these particular countries who have what is called universal jurisdiction, or some other form of jurisdiction like active personality or passive personality jurisdiction, they can also bring court cases, and they have in some instances. And while it has not been completely comprehensive by any means, there have been some real landmark cases in domestic jurisdictions that allow for a pronouncement of what happened, to create the narrative and the historical record of the fact that ISIS did perpetrate, through individuals who are on trial, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other international criminal acts against Yazidis. And this has been extremely important for the Yazidi people to have some aspect, some form of redress for what happened in 2014 and beyond.
Jocelyn, you mentioned Iraq legal system, and I just want to ask, the Iraq legal system does not address Yazidi cases as genocide cases, and mostly deal with them as acts of terrorism or sexual violence and so on and so forth. Is it because Iraq system is ineffective, or this situation reflects some sort of tensions between Yazidis and other parts of Iraqi population?
I think both of those things are true. I think there are limitations under the Iraqi domestic law that don't allow for some of these international crimes to practically be prosecuted in domestic courts. That said, there are domestic crimes that have been perpetrated, and yet we are still seeing prosecutors who are generally bringing perpetrators, ISIS fighters, to account for material support to terrorism only, which carries the death penalty. And a big reason that we see these cases go forward as we do is because these are pretty low-hanging fruit cases for prosecutors to try. It's easy to prove material support to terrorism, being a member of a terrorist group, that membership being proven, and the case is won. It is a lot messier to bring witnesses and others who are, potentially contradicted in a case to court and try these other particular crimes. And so I think for a multitude of reasons, prosecutors have maybe under circumstances that are very limited in evidence gathering, in the ability to hold or detain perpetrators, are bringing these cases against ISIS fighters just solely on the terrorism charges, which has left the Yazidis feeling extremely distraught at the idea that these individuals are being executed, are being convicted, and then receive the death penalty for these crimes, and are never held to account for what they did specifically to the Yazidi survivors who would like their day in court and like to have their day for potential redress for what happened.
I wonder, how has the fact of atrocities and genocide affected Yazidis' access to the refugee status or asylum? Recently, the European Union Court of Justice decided that due to Taliban's severe restrictions and violence against Afghan women specifically, it's enough to be an Afghan national and female to get asylum. Have you observed something like that with the Yazidi escaped from the Daesh atrocities?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a really big question when, generally, I think the world responded in a compassionate humanitarian way to the Yazidis. Germany took in many Yazidi refugees and has now the highest population of Yazidis outside of the region of Kurdistan and northern Iraq and Turkey. So it is remarkable the way that Yazidis were welcomed. I think the issue, though, is how they are able to receive asylum, right? Like actual status in countries. I think that has been a challenge because each individualized claim has to be proven, that fear of persecution. Whereas in the, the European case to which you're referring, there could be some kind of declaration or some kind of regulation that countries could pass to say, if you are Yazidi and you can prove that you are Yazidi fleeing this particular situation, you should be able to receive asylum or other permanent type of status in a particular country to which you are seeking refuge.
Jocelyn, I would like to ask you to reflect more about the state responsibility. In 2022, a team of international lawyers and academics published a report entitled State Responsibility and the Genocide of Yazidis, which provides significant evidence that three states, Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, have allegedly failed and continue to fail in their obligations to prevent and punish genocide, thus violating, in this sense, the Genocide Convention. How can we deal with this problem internationally? Have there been any developments in this regard?
Yeah, another really great question. So I think we're just starting to open up the possibilities with international responsibility of states for international crimes and including genocide. And we need to think about going to states, right, directly to say, you are responsible, and politically, those states responding with reparations plans, with positive, acts toward accountability and justice in order to comply with their obligations under the Genocide Convention, among other conventions on human rights. But if those states are reluctant or are even resistant to those obligations to which they must comply, then we can see opportunities for third states to sue these particular states in the International Court of Justice, for example, because states parties to the Genocide Convention, and now because the Genocide Convention is considered to be customary international law, and the crime and the prohibition of genocide being jus cogens and erga omnes, meaning that all states have a responsibility to prevent and to punish and provide redress for genocide wherever it occurs. You could imagine cases being brought if you have the political will for a particular state to sue one of these particular states or all of these states for the failure to prevent, and potentially I guess in these cases, individual perpetration was mainly the non-state actor, so not really committing genocide, but potentially failing to hold those individual perpetrators to account and provide redress for the Yazidis and others who were victimized under Daesh and the atrocities that were perpetrated. So I would say that the International Court of Justice is a potential venue that has been, up until very recently, underutilized. But we are seeing a shift where states now do have a political will or an impetus to bring these claims on behalf of particular groups or on behalf of the international community as a whole. So maybe we'll see some more of these particular kinds of cases in the near future for justice and accountability for Yazidis.
Jocelyn, can you comment on the current situation with Yazidi in Iraq, especially I would say, on the kind of social atmosphere or social climate around the Yazidi community. Can they return? Can they live their life? Can they preserve their ethnic and religious identity in the current situation?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked this question, Dmytro. I think that it's a really difficult situation 10 years on for the Yazidi population. There were recent reports, I believe, that over 300,000 Yazidis remain displaced, and there are more than 2,500 people who mostly are women and children and mostly women and girls who remain missing. And many Yazidis are feeling unsafe to return home to their homeland. Many of their homes were physically destroyed. And in Sinjar, there were many Yazidis who lived in Sinjar prior to the genocide, but now the infrastructure is completely decimated. There is absolutely inadequate healthcare, no jobs, no employment opportunities, nothing for young people, no schools. And so the situation remains dire. And I think that, the trauma that the survivors feel about what had happened also keeps many from returning home. I think that the biggest uh, request or demand that Yazidis have now is locating their missing relatives. This is often the case in post-atrocity settings with victim groups. They cannot rest until they find the whereabouts, even if those individuals are no longer alive. They need to have some form of closure. And those many of those individuals we knew were abducted and enslaved, slave traded, but we don't necessarily know their whereabouts today. And the Iraqi government has formed a committee to create a mechanism for finding missing persons and finding them in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. But this is going to take a lot of resources, a lot of cooperation on the part of civil society for any of this to actually succeed on the ground. And there was an agreement for it was called the 2020 Sinjar Agreement, and that agreement was created without any input from the Yazidi community. And therefore, it really is not succeeding to have some sort of power sharing plan in the aftermath of these attacks, and power sharing between the KRG, the Kurdish government, and the Iraqi government, that both of these entities claiming, right, the Sinjar, the area as their own territory. And so you still see this instability happening in the region. And I think that is keeping folks in a state of limbo without any future plan to return to their homeland. And again, knowing the Yazidis' religious teachings and beliefs, knowing that that is a very sacred, holy place, it's so detrimental to the Yazidis as a group, as a religious minority, and an ethnic group for their survival, not to return home. So that has created lots of distress in the Yazidi community.
Recently, I saw a report from camps located in Iraq where people allegedly involved with the ISIS and their relatives have been staying with probably no right to leave. And the conditions of living there are quite awful. And what is even more important, and seems like neither international actors or the Iraq government has any plan of what they're going to do with these individuals. And the situation looks like a ticking bomb because there are many minors in these camps and they're growing up in these awful conditions. And I assume with the feeling that they and their parents are treated in a very unjust manner, which means that at some point some of them might want to start or contribute to a new circle of violence.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So there are thousands of suspected Islamic State members and their families, including children, who are still in these what they call closed camps, such as Al-Hol. They're held in this sort of limbo, right? They're not necessarily free to go, but they're not under any kind of indictment either. And there probably would never be evidence to convict or, permanently prosecute or detain these individuals. And, this does create issues with another, aspect of intergenerational trauma. Hundreds of, these crimes are also happening in these camps. So you have ISIS perpetrators, you have victims, Yazidi and other victims of the Islamic State in these same camps. And so you can imagine that there is this perpetual state of potential violence, of threat of violence, and sometimes even actual violence. And that can lead to re-traumatization, new forms of traumatization, retaliation, right, for what was done to families or what is perceived to have been done to families. And, these cases that are going forward are super rare. And so you have many people in these camps without a lot of structure, without a lot of opportunity to receive education, to have gainful employment. And the cycle of violence is, really being perpetuated in these camps. And it really goes completely against our understanding of how to mitigate or how to prevent future atrocity harms. We know, right, that the biggest risk factor for atrocity is experiencing prior atrocity. And without intervention to break that cycle just keeps going from one generation to the next. And we're seeing, children being raised in situations where maybe their only opportunity is to continue in this jihadist fight for a caliphate or some dream of a future that would eliminate a certain group and pursue a sort of utopia for another group. And that is the continuation, really, of genocidal violence.
How does the situation of Yazidis in these camps look from the legal perspective? Do they have any chance of fair trial and release at some point? Because some of these situations look a bit questionable from the international point of view, I think. What your reflection on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we had UNITAD. We had this UN mechanism that was gathering evidence for potential trial, but that has since closed. That has been it ran out of funding, no longer supported by the United Nations, and has closed. That has caused all kinds of issues for access to evidence, for the ability for any trials to go forward. Then you have really questionable prosecutions happening domestically in particular situations around the camps and in Iraq specifically, where fair trial rights have been called into question. Certainly, the administration of the death penalty being contrary to international law for the rights, human rights of individuals. And so these cases, while they're moving forward, are not necessarily seen, even by Yazidis, as a form of justice and accountability, and then by the international community are seen as problematic more generally for accountability for the crimes that Daesh committed at that time. And I'm not really so hopeful to see any of that changing, because UNITAD was a very important, it had an important role to play in the region, potentially to train prosecutors to ensure rule of law and fair trial rights were respected. And without really those mechanisms, it becomes more difficult for many reasons, including a lack of resources for any of those cases to have hope for more fair outcomes.
And maybe as the final question, we know that Holocaust and the experience of the Second World War in general has changed international law a lot, right? International criminal law, international human rights law, and so on. Do you see anything in the Yazidi genocide case that has changed international law?
That's a really great question. For me, the 10-year pursuit of justice and accountability for the Yazidis has led me to see and visibilize and advocate for additions to, for example, the Rome Statute and the draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty for the inclusion of the slave trade as its own international crime. So in the wake of the Yazidi genocide, it was also apparent, and it was very well known because there was a ministry that ISIS formed specifically for the buying and selling of slaves. And it really demonstrated this particular genocide and enslavement, atrocity crimes generally, demonstrated that really interconnected link that I'm not sure has been so well articulated or well understood up until now in international law. Because even in World War II, you see this intricate link between the forced labor in the camps, the enslavement of individuals who then were executed in the camps in the Holocaust. And then you also see on the front in Japan, the so-called comfort women who were sexually enslaved as part and parcel of the fueling of the war effort. And so that link between enslavement, slave trade, and genocide is something that I think the Yazidi example has really brought to the fore and has made a lot of advocacy within the international community about revisiting why the slave trade isn't found in some of our international treaties and in some of our most recent statutes of international criminal courts or these specialized tribunals. And that despite the fact that the slave trade is one of the oldest crimes under international law. And so I think that's one way in which this particular genocide and enslavement situation really helped to shape at least the advocacy around the future of international law and potential amendments to the Rome Statute and potential inclusion of slave trade in the Crimes Against Humanity draft treaty that is now before the Sixth Committee of the General Assembly, and we hope will go forward to be actually discussed, debated, and drafted in the coming years for the world community to ratify.
I think this is a very good sort of semi-positive note to finish our podcast today. So this is all for today. We are really grateful to Jocelyn for joining us and sharing these incredible insights. This is Merilin, Kiviorg, and Dmytro Vovk for FoRB, a podcast, part of the Talk About Law and Religion blog of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the opinions of the faculty or staff of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies or the J. Reuben Clark Law School, nor do they necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or its sponsoring church. Tune into additional episodes at talkabout.info. iclars.org or on Spotify and YouTube. Thank you.